She smelled of Eli soap and rail yard soot. He smelled of bear grease and 30 winters of isolation. When she huddled against the cabin wall and whispered she was terrified of him, he didn't argue. He just dropped his axe and said, "Then I'll wait until you're not." The Union Pacific locomotive shrieked against the iron rails, spitting a cloud of black ash into the pale November sky. Harlan stood on the edge of the wooden platform, letting the soot settle onto the shoulders of his buffalo hide coat. He didn't brush it off. The town of Bitter Creek was a mud-choked ulcer of a settlement at the base of the Rockies, smelling of cheap whiskey, wet horsehair, and raw sewage. Harlan hated it. He came down from his claim only twice a year, once to sell his pelts, once to buy salt, coffee, and gunpowder. This time, he was picking up a wife. He felt entirely foolish. At 42, he was a massive, weather-beaten structure of a man. His beard was thick with gray, his knuckles scarred white from skinning knives and frostbite. He had spent 3 years' worth of trapping money to pay the agency in St. Louis, driven by a winter loneliness so acute it had started making him hear voices in the howl of the wind. He wanted someone to talk to, someone to keep the fire going while he ran the trap lines. The passenger car doors clattered open. A few businessmen in bowler hats stepped down, followed by a handful of miners. Then, her. Harlan knew it was her because she possessed the frantic, hunted look of a stray dog cornered in an alley. She held a cardboard suitcase tightly against her chest. Her wool coat was frayed at the cuffs, dyed a drab brown that did nothing for her pale, exhausted face. Her hair, a dull, dusty blonde, was pinned back haphazardly, strands escaping to stick to the sweat on her neck. She looked small, breakable. Harlan felt a sudden, sharp flare of irritation. They sent me a child, he thought. She'll freeze to death before January. He stepped forward. His boots sank into the slushy mud with a wet sucking sound. When he stopped in front of her, she physically recoiled, her shoulders jerking upward. "You Nora?" he asked. His voice was a rusted hinge. He hadn't spoken aloud to another human being since May. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to his massive chest, then down to his boots. Unable to meet his face, she gave a single, jerky nod. "I'm Harlan." He reached out to take her suitcase. Nora flinched, pulling the bag tighter against her ribs. Her knuckles were stark white. Harlan let his hand hover in the air for a second before dropping it to his side. He didn't force the issue. "Wagons this way," he said, turning his back on her. He didn't check to see if she followed, though he strained his ears to catch the uneven, dragging sound of her worn leather boots scraping across the boardwalk. The ride up the mountain was an agonizing exercise in endurance. Harlan's buckboard wagon had no springs, and the logging road was gutted with deep, frozen ruts. Every jolt sent a violent shudder through the wooden bench. Nora sat as far from him as the seat allowed, gripping the iron handrail until her fingers looked bruised. The air grew thinner, sharper. It tasted of metallic frost and pine needles. 2 hours in, the temperature plummeted. Harlan, accustomed to the biting chill, barely noticed, but he heard the rapid, shallow clicking of Nora's teeth. He glanced over. Her lips were taking on a bluish tint. She was shivering violently but making no sound, suffering in total, stubborn silence. With a grunt, Harlan reached behind the seat and dragged up a heavy wolf pelt blanket. He tossed it roughly into her lap. Nora gasped, flinching as the heavy fur hit her. She looked at the pelt, then at him, her chest heaving. "Rapid," he barked, louder than he intended. The wind snatched the words, making them sound harsh, like a reprimand. She quickly pulled the stiff, gamey-smelling fur around her shoulders, burying her face in the collar. She smelled of old train smoke and fear. Harlan gripped the leather reins, his calloused hands feeling numb not from the cold, but from an unfamiliar, deep-seated awkwardness. He was furious with the agency for sending him someone so fragile, and furious with himself for being so brutally incapable of offering comfort. He drove the mules harder. The silence between them grew as heavy and suffocating as the impending snow clouds rolling over the jagged peaks ahead. They had another 3 hours to go, and Harlan was beginning to realize that the suffocating quiet of his cabin was about to be replaced by a tension far worse. Dusk had bled the color from the mountains by the time they reached the clearing. The cabin sat nestled against a wall of black pines, a rough-hewn box of thick timber and mud chinking. It wasn't much to look at, but it was fortified against the world. Harlan pulled the mules to a halt. "We're here." Nora didn't move immediately. She stared at the dark, silent structure as if it were a mausoleum. Harlan jumped down, the snow crunching loudly under his weight. He didn't wait for her this time. He walked to her side of the wagon, reached up, and grabbed her by the waist to lift her down. She let out a choked, terrified noise, her hands flying up to push against his shoulders. She felt like a bundle of dry twigs. He set her in the snow immediately and stepped back, his jaw tightening. "Door's unlocked," he said gruffly. "Go in. I gotta unhitch the team." She grabbed her cardboard suitcase and scrambled away from him, stumbling in the calf-deep snow before reaching the heavy oak door. She pushed it open and disappeared into the pitch black of the cabin. By the time Harlan finished with the mules and carried his rifle and supplies inside, the cabin was still dark. Nora was standing in the exact center of the room, completely motionless, the wolf pelt dragging on the floor behind her. Harlan struck a sulfur match against the doorframe. The sharp, rotten egg scent flared, cutting through the stale smell of cold ashes, dried tobacco, and cured leather that permeated the room. He lit the kerosene lamp on the table. Yellow light spilled across the rough-sawn floorboards, illuminating the chaos of a bachelor's existence. Steel traps hung from rusted nails. A half-scraped deer hide was stretched on a wooden frame in the corner. His unmade bed, piled with heavy quilts and animal skins, dominated the back wall. It was a brutal, purely functional space. He caught Nora looking at a heavy, iron skinning knife resting on the butcher block. Her eyes widened. Harlan let out a long breath, pulling his gloves off with his teeth. He felt a sudden, crushing exhaustion. He was hungry, his back ached, and having a stranger in his space made his skin crawl. He walked to the cast-iron stove. "I'll heat up the coffee," he muttered. "Got salt, pork, and beans. Not much else till I hunt tomorrow." He grabbed a heavy iron skillet from a hook. His fingers, stiff from the cold, fumbled. The skillet slipped, crashing onto the stovetop with a deafening, metallic clang. Nora shrieked. It was a raw, visceral sound. She scrambled backward, her heels catching on the uneven floorboards, and slammed hard against the log wall. She dropped her suitcase. She pressed her hands flat against the rough wood behind her, panting, her eyes blown wide with blind panic. Harlan froze. The skillet rested on the stove. He slowly turned his head to look at her. She looked like she was waiting for a blow. Her shoulders were hunched, her chin tucked to her collarbone. "It slipped," Harlan said, his voice low. Nora didn't relax. She was trembling so hard the floorboards seemed to vibrate. Her chest hitched, and tears finally spilled over her lower lids, cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. Harlan took a step toward her. "Look, miss." "Don't." The word was barely a breath, but it stopped him cold. Harlan stood in the middle of the room, a 6'3" mountain of a man, in a blood-stained coat, looking at a woman who weighed no more than 100 pounds, soaking wet. His own frustration spiked. He had given up his peace for this. He had brought her here to be a wife, a partner, and she was looking at him like he was a monster. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his tone harder than he meant it to be. Nora squeezed her eyes shut. "I'm scared of you," she whispered. Her voice broke on the final word, a pathetic, broken sound that echoed in the quiet cabin. The anger in Harlan drained out, leaving behind a hollow, heavy shame. He looked down at his own hands. They were massive, filthy, covered in calluses and old blood. He smelled the rancid bear grease on his boots. He saw the iron skinning knife on the table. Of course she was scared. He had dragged her from whatever miserable, crowded city she knew and dropped her into the wild with a giant who spoke in grunts. He slowly lowered his hands. "All right," Harlan said. He walked past her, deliberately keeping a wide distance. He went to the bed, grabbed a thick wool blanket and a pillow stuffed with goose down. He walked back to the fireplace, dragging a heavy wooden armchair to face the hearth. He dropped the bedding into the chair. Nora opened her eyes, watching him with wary confusion. Harlan picked up his rifle, cracked the action to ensure it was loaded, and leaned it against the wall near the door. He didn't look at her. "The bed is yours," he said quietly, his back to her. "The food is on the stove. The door locks from the inside. I'll sleep in the chair." He sat down in the wooden chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He stared at the cold, dead ashes in the hearth, refusing to turn around. "You said you're scared of me," Harlan murmured, into the dim room. "Then I'll wait until you're not." He didn't hear her move for a long time. The only sound was the wind picking up outside, whistling through the chinking in the logs, a long, mournful sound that swallowed the silence of the cabin. Finally, he heard the soft rustle of wool, the scrape of her suitcase being pulled across the floor, and the creak of the bed springs as she sat down on the very edge of the mattress. Harlan closed his eyes, wrapped the scratchy wool blanket around his shoulders, and listened to the shallow, terrified breathing of his new wife from across the room. It was going to be a long winter. The cold woke him. It always did. The fire had burned down to glowing orange embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the rough log walls. Harlan's neck was stiff. The wooden chair offered zero comfort, but he hadn't moved since midnight, terrified that the mere creak of the floorboards would send the woman in his bed back into a blind panic. He stood, his joints popping in the frigid air. The temperature in the cabin had dropped sharply. He could see his breath hang pale against the gloom. He glanced at the bed. Nora was a lump beneath the heavy quilts, completely submerged, except for a patch of dusty blonde hair. She was breathing evenly. Harlan turned to the stove. He moved with a practiced, deliberate slowness, making as little noise as a man of his size could manage. He fed dry pine kindling into the iron belly of the stove, striking a sulfur match. The wood caught with a low roar. He filled the enameled pot with water from the bucket, breaking the thin layer of ice on top with his heavy thumb, and set it to boil. He didn't wake her. He pulled on his stiff, frozen boots, grabbed his rifle, and stepped out into the pre-dawn gray. The cold hit like a physical blow. The wind whipped off the high peaks, carrying microscopic shards of ice that stung his cheeks. Harlan welcomed it. It made sense. The mountains were brutal, but they were predictable. The fragile, terrified creature sleeping in his cabin was a complication he didn't know how to navigate. When Nora finally woke, the cabin was empty. She sat up, pulling the thick quilt to her chin. The fire was roaring behind the iron grate of the stove, radiating a fierce, dry heat that smelled of wood smoke and hot metal. On the heavy butcher block table, a tin cup sat next to a plate covered with a cloth. She crept out of bed. Her boots were still on. Her legs ached from the brutal wagon ride, and her stomach felt completely hollow. She approached the table cautiously. Under the cloth was a slab of cooked salt pork and a thick piece of hardtack bread. The tin cup held black coffee, still steaming. Nora ate standing up. The pork was intensely salty, greasy, and tough, but it was the best thing she had tasted in 3 days. She looked around the room in the daylight. It was sparse, utilitarian. No curtains, no rugs. But it wasn't filthy. The floor was swept. The tools were hung in orderly rows. In the corner, sitting on a small wooden crate, were 3 books. She walked over, wiping her greasy fingers on her skirt. Anatomy of the Human Body. A worn copy of the Odyssey. A thick leather ledger. The heavy latch on the front door clattered. Nora spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. She instinctively backed into the corner, pressing her shoulders against the rough logs. Harlan stepped inside. He carried the cold with him, a cloud of frigid air rolling off his massive frame. In his left hand, he held 2 dead snowshoe hares by the hind legs. Blood dripped onto the floorboards, bright red against the dull wood. He saw her cowering in the corner. He stopped dead. The exhaustion in his eyes was palpable. He didn't say a word. He just walked to the wash basin, dropped the hares onto the butcher block, and turned his back to her to scrub his hands with lye soap. "I'll skin 'em," he said, his voice a low rumble over the splashing water. "You can boil the water." It was a command, but not a cruel one. It was a statement of fact. They had to eat. Nora stared at the dead animals. The blank, glassy eyes. The blood pooling on the wood. A memory flashed the suffocating heat of the Chicago meatpacking district, the relentless, bone-crushing line where she had spent 4 years slicing offal before the foreman started looking at her too closely, forcing her to flee west to a husband she'd never met. She stepped away from the wall. Her legs felt weak, but she forced them to move. Harlan turned around, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped. Nora was standing at the table. She reached out and picked up his heavy iron skinning knife. The blade was longer than her hand. Harlan tensed, his weight shifting forward. Nora didn't look at him. She flipped the first hair onto its back. Her hands were trembling, but her grip on the handle was correct. With a quick, practiced motion, she made a precise incision down the belly, slipping the blade under the skin without puncturing the meat. Harlan watched in stunned silence. The terrified, fragile girl from the train station was meticulously stripping the hide off the carcass with the brutal efficiency of a slaughterhouse veteran. "I'll need a bowl for the innards," Nora said. Her voice was thin, raspy from disuse, but it didn't shake. Harlan blinked. He moved to the shelf, grabbed a tin basin, and set it beside her. He stood close enough to smell the stale train smoke still clinging to her hair beneath the sharp, metallic scent of raw meat. She didn't flinch away. "You've done this," he observed quietly. 4 years. "Packing plant," she muttered, not looking up, her hands moving mechanically. "I know how to cut meat. I don't like sudden, loud noises." Harlan looked at the heavy iron skillet sitting on the stove, remembering the deafening crash from the night before. He nodded slowly, though she wasn't looking at him. "I'll try to keep the noise down," he said. Nora paused her, cutting for a fraction of a second. She didn't say thank you, but her shoulders dropped, just a fraction of an inch. By late December, the mountain was entombed in white. The snowdrifts reached the lower window panes. The silence outside was absolute, a heavy, muffling blanket that isolated them from the rest of the world. Inside, the silence had changed. It was no longer suffocating. It had become a workable, functional quiet. Harlan and Nora moved around each other like two gears in a complex machine, never quite touching, but operating in sync. She learned how to keep the stove burning hot enough to banish the drafts. He learned to knock his boots against the porch post before entering, rather than stomping them on the floorboards, sparing her the jarring noise. He still slept in the wooden chair. She still slept in the bed. They rarely spoke more than a dozen words a day. The routine broke on a Tuesday. A storm had rolled in fast, a blinding squall of whiteout conditions. Harlan had gone out to check the near traps just past the tree line. He should have been back by noon. By 3 o'clock, the wind was screaming around the eaves like a dying animal, and the light in the cabin had turned a bruised, slate gray. Nora paced. She fed the fire until the iron stove glowed dull red, but the chill in her bones had nothing to do with the temperature. She kept looking at the heavy oak door. Her cynical mind told her to prepare for the worst. If he died out there, she was a widow, stranded in a frozen wasteland. She would freeze or starve before spring. But underneath the practical panic of survival, a different, sharper fear twisted in her gut. She realized she didn't want him to be dead. The giant, quiet man who made her coffee and surrendered his bed without a word of complaint. At 4, the door slammed open. The wind violently threw a sheet of snow into the room. Harlan staggered across the threshold, dropping his rifle. He slammed the door shut with his good shoulder, then collapsed against it, sliding down the wood until he hit the floor with a heavy thud. Nora rushed forward. "Harlan!" He was covered in snow, breathing in ragged, wet gasps. His face was the color of old ash. He clutched his right thigh. Blood, thick, dark, and hot, was seeping through his heavy wool trousers, pooling fast on the floorboards. "Slipped," he ground out, his teeth clenched in agony. Ice sheet on the ridge. Caught a jagged deadfall on the way down. He reached into his coat with shaking fingers and pulled out a leather strip. "Gotta tie it off. Too cold to. My hands ain't working." His thick fingers were white, stiff as wood. He couldn't grip the leather. Nora dropped to her knees in the blood and melting snow. The sight of the arterial red should have sent her into a panic. Instead, the frantic, terrified bird inside her chest went dead silent. The packing plant had taught her how to butcher. The crowded, disease-ridden tenements of Chicago had taught her how to patch things back together. She snatched the leather strip from his hands. She wrapped it tight above the tear in his trousers and pulled with all her meager weight, knotting it ruthlessly. Harlan let out a harsh, guttural groan, his head falling back against the door. "Knife," Nora demanded. Harlan numbly pointed to his belt. She drew the heavy skinning knife and sliced through his blood-soaked trousers, exposing the wound. It was deep. The dead branch had torn through the muscle, a jagged, ugly gash that pumped sluggishly. "I need boiling water, needle, and the silk thread from my bag," she ordered. Her voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It cracked like a whip. "Tell me where your whiskey is." "Under the floorboard." "By the stove," he rasped, his eyes glassy. For the next hour, the cabin was a surgical theater of desperation. Nora poured the cheap rot-gut whiskey over the open wound. Harlan screamed, a terrifying, raw sound that tore from his chest, his massive hands gripping the legs of the butcher block until the wood groaned. Nora didn't flinch. She threaded the needle with steady, blood-slicked fingers. "Hold still," she commanded. She worked with brutal efficiency, pushing the needle through the tough, calloused skin of his thigh, pulling the silk tight, knotting it. 8 stitches, 12, 15. She didn't look at his face. She focused entirely on the raw meat and the thread, shutting out the smell of copper and sweat. When she tied the final knot and snipped the thread, her shoulders slumped. The adrenaline bled out of her all at once, leaving her hollow and shaking. She sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. Harlan was breathing heavily, his head resting on the floor. His face was slick with sweat despite the cold. He slowly turned his head to look at her. She was kneeling in a puddle of his blood, her hair plastered to her forehead, her pale face streaked with soot and grime. She looked exhausted. She looked magnificent. "Where'd you learn to sew like that?" he whispered, his voice incredibly weak. "City Hospital ward," she replied flatly, refusing to meet his eyes as she gathered the bloody rags, sewing up factory workers who got caught in the industrial looms. "You ain't the first man I've put back together." Harlan closed his eyes. The pain in his leg was a blinding sheet of white heat, but beneath it, a profound sense of relief washed over him. He wasn't alone. For the first time in years, he wasn't carrying the weight of his own survival entirely by himself. "Thank you," he breathed. Nora paused. She looked at the giant of a man, laid out on the floor, vulnerable and broken, trusting her implicitly. The fear that had gripped her since she stepped off the train, the fear of his size, his strength, his silence, shattered completely. He wasn't a threat. He was just a man bleeding on the floor who had slept in a rigid wooden chair for a month, so she wouldn't be afraid. "I'll help you to the bed," she said softly. Harlan opened his eyes. "That's your bed." "You're a fool, Harlan," Nora said, a ghost of a wry, cynical smile touching her lips for the first time. "I ain't dragging you off the floor just to let you freeze in a chair." She slid her arm under his good shoulder. With a massive effort, groaning in unison, they managed to get him on his feet. He leaned heavily on her, entirely dependent on her slight frame as she guided him across the room. They collapsed onto the mattress together. Harlan was too exhausted to move. Nora pulled the heavy wolf pelt over him, tucking it tightly around his broad shoulders. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching his chest rise and fall. Outside, the wind continued to howl, battering the log walls, trying to find a way in. Inside, the fire snapped in the stove, radiating a fierce heat. Nora reached out, her fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second, before resting her hand gently over his massive, scarred knuckles. He didn't pull away. "I'll sit with you," she whispered into the quiet room, "until you fall asleep." Harlan didn't say anything, but as he drifted into an exhausted, feverish sleep, his fingers weakly curled around hers. The wait was over. If Nora and Harlan's brutal fight for survival in the frozen mountains kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this story with anyone who loves gritty, slow-burn frontier dramas where actions speak louder than words. Drop a comment below. Did you expect Nora's gritty past to be the thing that saved Harlan's life? Turn on notifications so you never miss our next gripping audio drama. Thanks for watching.